People will often say God doesn't want you poor. Now, I understand why they say that, but it really depends on how the person hearing it takes it as to whether it's actually true or not. And it has some dangerous implications to just be said and then not explained further. Welcome to the My Two Cents podcast, where we explore the financial things that many of us never learned in church. Every week, we'll dive into what Scripture says about work, saving, investing, debt, generosity, stewardship, and everything in between. Not to build bigger bank accounts, but to build hearts that trust God more fully. I'm Sarah Crown, and these are My Two Cents. It is a great day to be in my office recording a podcast. I'll take my glasses off so they don't have weird reflections in the light. It's 91 degrees today, and my office is the coldest room in the house. It always is, about 10 degrees colder than upstairs. So I'm very happy to be tucked away in my corner office. What we're talking about today is this idea of maybe God wants you poor. Now, before you come after me in the comments, please listen to the whole episode, because I'm going to be shedding some light on some things that you may or may not have heard around social media. In the Christian finance niche, see this a lot on social media. It's this idea that people will often say God doesn't want you poor. Now, I understand why they say that, but I don't like what it could potentially imply. It really depends on how the person hearing it takes it as to whether it's actually true or not. And it has some dangerous implications to just be said and then not explained further. And so we're going to look into that. We're going to look into maybe God does want you poor. And then I'm actually going to teach you some things that I found so valuable when I was poor. There was a season in my life where we were poor. I'll just put it that way. I'm sure there was people poorer than us, but for Americans, relatively, we were quite poor. God taught me so much in that season. And I think some of the things that I learned could be really helpful for anyone who is in that season. Whether God may want them there or not, it's going to help you get through that season, potentially get out of that season. And so stick around for that, because those are something that I just really want to share with you in hopes that they will encourage you if you're in that season right now. Okay, so let's just kind of jump into a little bit of theology here. There's these influencers, Christian influencers, preachers, pastors, authors, whatever you may have it, that say God doesn't want you poor. The reason I say that I know where they're coming from is because, in a sense, that is very true. We look at creation before the fall, and we see that no one was lacking anything. There was no lack. There was complete abundance, and not just abundance of material goods, but just abundance of relationship with each other, with relationship with God. And that was what God called very good. We know that he created it to be like that. And once he comes again, we also know that there will be no more poverty. There will be no more injustice. There will be no more of these things, because we know God's heart is not for them. God's heart is not for anyone to be in poverty. It is not for anyone to be poor. It's not for anyone to be treated with injustice. It is for humanity's holistic good. That's who he is. He is loving and kind and generous and just beyond what we can even imagine. And so there is very much truthfulness to God doesn't want you poor. The reason that I don't really care for saying that without explaining it a little further is because there's actually another piece of God's will for us. Theologians call this God's provisional will. And that means that as much as he has this heart, this overarching will for all humanity to flourish, for all humanity to be in perfect relationship with him and perfect relationships with each other, we live in a broken world. And so that means that sometimes he does will certain circumstances and seasons in our life in order to bring us closer to him, in order to build us and sanctify us. And so it's still also true that God maybe wants you to be poor. Let me explain it this way, just to clarify it with a story. As a parent, if you were a parent, you would never want your child to go through chemotherapy. that would be like the most horrible thing. You would never want that. And yet, if your child were to get cancer, that would suddenly be a thing that you might want for your child to go through chemotherapy, because in the end, you understand what it does. Now, obviously, that's not a perfect illustration because God is not reacting to circumstances, but just so you understand that word want and how it can mean different things and say different things. That's why we have to be careful with that phrase. For me, honestly, being poor, I can't even imagine learning the things that I learned there. I can't even imagine drawing close to the Lord like I did in that season. I can't even imagine learning the lessons I learned there any other way than being in the season. And I'm so thankful that I was. And I'm also thankful that I'm not anymore. It's fun to do the budget when you're not scraping every last penny. Needless to say, there's just so much more to that conversation that I wanted to give you a nuance of, so that when you hear that, you can understand, one, where they're coming from, and two, how that might not necessarily be a way to interpret your own circumstances. So if the Apostle Paul, we know for sure that he was poor in certain times, right? He said, I know how to be content with little and with much. He said that he often went without food and without shelter. He lists off this whole rant about things that he has gone through that definitely don't sound like living in a comfortable, wealthy life. If he was in those circumstances and thought to himself, wait a second, I'm poor right now. God doesn't want me to be poor. I must be living outside of God's will. I must not be doing what God wants me to do because God doesn't want me to be poor. Then we've run into a problem, right? Because now we're interpreting our circumstances in a way that does not actually reflect the truth. Because the truth is, if Paul had believed that, we wouldn't have half of the New Testament. I think about the persecuted church who often lives in poverty. What if they believed, oh, God doesn't want me to be poor, and so the fact that I'm poor right now when I'm following Jesus with everything is that he's abandoned me. He doesn't care about me. He doesn't actually give me blessings, because if he doesn't want me poor and I'm living fully for him, then he's not trustworthy because he hasn't given me what I feel like I need. If the underground church believed that, there wouldn't be an underground church. And so it can be a really dangerous thing if it's not interpreted correctly. When they say God doesn't want you poor, they use Bible verses to back it up, but then don't pull in the nuance that he maybe does for the season, for a purpose, for a lifetime, and that you can for sure be like dead set on the hope and guarantee that on the other side of eternity, there is abundance waiting for you, that you'll never see poverty again. That is a promise of God that we can really cling to, and we know for certain is a hope of ours. We can cling to that. So yeah, just wanted to bring in a little bit of that nuance to the conversation without going into crazy details or crazy theological depth. There just is more to it than just God maybe wants you poor, God maybe wants you rich. We don't always know, but what we do know is that God always wants us faithful. When we look at Bible characters, we see that there was some who lived with very little, like Jesus. We see that there are some that lived with a lot, like Abraham. Job had a lot, and then a devastating nothing, and then a lot. And same with Joseph. He was a slave and a prisoner, and then he became a ruler. But through every season that they lived in, whether they lived their whole life with little, whether they lived their whole life with a lot, whether they lived through seasons of lot and seasons of less, they were faithful. And that's what I want you to walk away from this episode feeling like, okay, my circumstances does not mean God's abandoned me. If I have less, that does not mean that God is upset with me. If I have less, that does not mean that I'm outside of God's will. If I have more, that doesn't mean that I'm outside of God's will, or that doesn't even necessarily mean that God himself has blessed me. Like we know, even the wicked prosper. So I'm just trying to bring you into a mindset that you may already know, but remind you once again that it's faithfulness that matters. It's becoming that matters. And that's what we see throughout the Bible is like their faithfulness to the Lord mattered. Their financial status was not what got them into Hebrews 11, that hall of fame, the hall of faith. It was how they loved the Lord and honored him and followed him. And so that matters more than anything else. And the financial status is really more of a classroom than anything. Whatever season we're going through, when we allow the Lord to use it, it makes us more Christ-like. If we don't allow the Lord to use it, it can ruin us, whether that is poverty or riches, okay? So I personally don't think there's like a balance point. There's a lot of people that will say there's a balance point. Christians shouldn't be rich and they shouldn't be poor. And I don't think that's actually true. What I do think is that no matter what circumstances you are in, that the Lord loves you and that he is for you, and that your faithfulness and your sanctification, your Christ-likeness, your holiness just matters so much more. And that just means that God has much bigger purposes than just your financial status. He has much bigger purposes, and he is looking into the future. He sees how everything affects everything, and we don't. We only have what's in front of us today. And so no matter what circumstances you're in, you can believe that God is trustworthy. You can believe that he is good, and you can believe that he is convicting and sanctifying and using whatever it is you're in, whether it is just like hardship. Like there's a lot of times that we're in poverty because of injustice, because of other people's sin that's done to us, because of our own sin. There's a lot of factors that can come into play, and we don't need to wear ourselves out trying to figure out what it is. All we need to do is keep coming to the Lord, keep bringing it to him, keep asking him to make us more like him. And those seasons become seasons of beauty and growth, even when they are extremely difficult and we would never want to go through them again, okay? All right, the last thing that I'm going to talk about, just shifting gears a little bit, is just things that I learned when we were poor that just helped me a ton. And I can't imagine learning any other way. And I hope that it sparks some ideas in your mind that if you are in that season now, you can start to look for God's fingerprints of how he's moving in you. One of the funnest things about not being poor is it gives you just this capacity to bless others on a whole nother level. That is so much fun. And I want you to be able to experience that fun. It doesn't keep you from blessing others. I most certainly did when we were poor. And yet now that we are no longer poor, just the capacity, the excitement, the fun of getting to bless other people is just tenfold. And I want you to be able to experience that if that's the Lord's will for you. Okay, the first thing that I learned when we were in a season of poverty is probably, I'm just going to give you the best one right off the bat, is how to be creative. So that means that I was looking at what I already had and saying, how can I make this work? I was looking at things and saying, how can I do this? I literally redecorated, revamped, repainted every square inch of our home on $0. I don't even know. It was definitely the Lord's hand, 100%. The Lord was with me every step of the way, but just being really patient and creative. So like thinking like, okay, I could do this. And if I did that, I would need this, but I could also do this. And then I wouldn't need that. I would just need this instead. Like all these different really creative options. For instance, I really wanted a shelf over my laundry room. My laundry room was like in a hallway and it wasn't cute, but anyone that came in my house could see it. It wasn't closed in a closet. It wasn't in a basement. It was just right next to my kitchen. And I really wanted it to be cute. So I wanted to build a shelf across the top where I could put some decorations and cutesy stuff in my laundry room. I didn't have money to go buy a shelf. And so I just had these ideas rolling around in my head, what I wanted it to look like. And one day we tore apart an old box spring mattress, and all the pine slats in there were gorgeous. They were fine. So I literally took the pine slats from an old box spring mattress, sanded them down. And a few days later, like the next week, I found my neighbors were throwing away a couple of shelf brackets and they were getting a little rusty. So I just put a little paint over the rust parts and cut my pine slats from the mattress down, made my own shelf, and it turned out so cute. Just very creative, very resourceful, just use what I already have. It seems like when I was willing to be creative that like just endless possibilities were at my fingertips. The reason I'm pointing out this one first is because creativity is actually a problem-solving function. If we have a problem, we have to use the creative part of our mind in order to fix the problem. And A lot of times when we're in a place where there just doesn't feel like enough, where we feel like we get like in this victim mentality or this poverty mentality, the scarcity mindset, that shuts off the creative part in our brain because we need to feel safe in order to feel like we can be creative. When there's not financial security, it can often shut off that exact thing that we need to get out of it. But here's the encouraging part. I want you to understand that our safety is not in our financial life. It's not in our bank account. It's in the hands of a God who loves us, who is for us, and literally holds the entire resources of the whole world. And when we rest in the goodness of our God, it unlocks that creativity in our brain again, because once again, we're safe in the arms of our Father and we don't need to depend on our bank account for our security. And so if you feel like you have been stuck, I want you to really take this to the Lord. And honestly, is there lies you've been believing about whether you are or aren't creative? A lot of people are like, oh, I'm just not creative. Yes, you are. You are made as a human in the image of God, and God is a creative God. We are made in his image. So any lie that is saying, oh, I'm just not a creative person, that's just not how I'm wired, is just false. You might not like art, but that does not mean you are not creative. Okay. A lot of mathematicians are creative. Problem solving is creative. There's lots of different ways to be creative. Do not believe the lie that you are not creative, because you absolutely are. It is part of who you are as a human. And if it has been squashed for years, start pulling those lies off, because you absolutely are creative. Okay. Off my soapbox about that one. Next thing I learned was just to be very empathetic. Like before, this is a little embarrassing. Before I went through this season of lack, I would definitely look at people and see their rusty old cars. And I didn't grow up rich, but there was just people that were like poorer than me that I just thought, oh, they just don't have their life together. If they don't have enough money for Christmas presents or stuff like that, they're just squandering it on other things. And through this season of really just being so dedicated to the budget, like pinching every single penny, being faithful with every single resource, and still feeling like I was just not having enough. Like my car, I hit with a deer and it had a different color hood on it, and it was all dented up on the one side, and it was starting to rust on the wheel wells. And it was definitely not the size that a family car should be. It was a two-door car, and I had kids. And so I would often feel and understand like I have judged people for looking like I look now. And my empathy grew enormously for people who are in hardships. Like I understand now not just how hard it is to make financial decisions and to be scraping by, but also just the emotional dysregulation that can bring. I understood how it felt and how it discombobulated your whole life, and just had an insane amount of empathy. I don't know why my kid is walking by my window in the rocks. What is he doing? It's too hot out there. Why is he even out there? Anyways, the third thing I learned was how much generosity makes a huge impact. There was one person, my mother-in-law, who noticed that we were having a hard time financially. She would come over to watch the kids, and the fridge would be fairly empty. Granted, she always came over on Thursday and my shopping day was on Friday. So like it was towards the end of the week. And I never asked her for anything. I would tell her like cleaning out the fridge is a great way to make sure you're actually not wasting any food, which is true. Another lesson I learned. But she would come back the next week with grocery bags of frozen pizzas and some brats and stuff. And her generosity just meant so much, so much. And so if there's one other thing I learned is that giving generously, being in people's lives enough to notice that they need help, is being the hands and feet of Jesus. Just be in people's life enough to know when they need help, whether that be financial help, emotional, relational help, whether that be like words of encouragement or just time, just being loved. Just notice people, be in their lives enough to notice. And so that is something that I still strive to do, is just try and be in people's lives enough to notice when they need help, which takes a lot of intentionality and takes a lot of work. And I'm definitely not as good at it as I wish I was, but it's something that I learned in that season that I am so grateful to have learned. And similar to that, another thing that I learned in that season was there's just always enough to give. Now, we backed down our giving in that season. We had been giving to our church about 1/10 of what we made, and then I sponsored 4 girls through World Vision on top of that. And during that season, we cut down our church giving, and so our total giving was about 10% of what we were giving. And there was still enough. Yes, it was hard, but I don't regret it. I don't regret for a minute backing down the giving that I had to church. I don't regret that at all. And I also don't regret at all continuing to give that amount. I think one of the biggest things that people can often feel confused about in times where it feels like there's not enough is that if there's not enough for me, there's not enough to give. And this is where my opinion might be different than others, and that's okay. You can come after me in the comments. I'm 100% for supporting local churches. I believe pastors should be paid fairly. I believe we should be taking really good care of our leaders, not just financially, but just with words of encouragement and things like that. But when you're in a place where you're barely putting food on the table and you're being careful with every single penny, it's okay to back down your giving to the church. It's okay to go ask the church for financial help. They should have something for that. A lot of people can feel really guilty for giving less to the church. And I just want to free you from that guilt, because that's not something God's holding on over your head. That's not something that God is saying, do this or I'm not going to get you out of debt. It's not. It's just not. I'll talk about that in a later episode more thoroughly. I'm going to continue in future episodes to dive a little bit more into theology type stuff. So if you want to know a little bit more, make sure you subscribe so that you can hear some of those deeper dives. But for today, we're just going to stay right here. Okay, last thing I learned is just that faithfulness matters. Faithfulness matters, not just spiritually, but financially. Having the grit to be faithful matters. You don't get out of poverty by being faithful for a week. It's like a diet. Everybody thinks, all right, I'm going to stick to my budget for a month and then my finances will be great. You stick to your diet for a month and you get a step closer to your goal, right? It's like it takes longer than a month. It takes faithfulness. It can take years. It can take decades, but the faithfulness matters. And even if you don't see the results that you hope to see, you will be able to get to heaven and say, you know what, I did my very best. The results didn't show the way that I wanted them to, but I did everything I could to be faithful. And you can have that peace in your heart that I did what a good steward was supposed to do, because the truth of the matter is we're just called to be faithful. We're just called to be obedient. The results are up to God. The results are for the Lord, and we can trust Him no matter what those results might look like. All right. I would honestly love to just sit across the table with a cup of coffee and talk you through any questions you might have about this or any thoughts you might have. But unfortunately, I can't do that. So if you want to just leave a comment with a little coffee cup, I will be happy to get back to you.